Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore sustainable placemaking, climate action in cities, and urban rewilding. I'm your host, Ross O'Kelly, an urban designer, educator, and sustainable placemaking consultant. Hello, you. Welcome back to the podcast, or if it's your first time, welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast. Today I want to talk about something that is very important to me and I feel like is not really talked about enough within our sector, which is what I call sustainable placemaking. So it's obviously a connection of the two terms, which is sustainability, sustainable design, and placemaking, the creation of good places to live, bringing these two things together. So essentially, I've really noticed a gap in sustainability discourse and work, and I feel like we've because built environment professions can be so siloed and so specialized, I found that there's two camps emerging. One is the sort of traditional design and planning professionals like architects, urban designers, master planners, who have some training in placemaking, maybe think of themselves as having a placemaking component to their work, certainly want to create places that are good for people to live in, that will stand the test of time, that have a sense of character and identity. And have experience with community engagement and maybe even co-design or co-creation with local communities. All of these really important skills for creating good places. And then on the other side, we have the more technical sustainability professionals, people who maybe come from engineering or science backgrounds and who are absolutely essential for doing the work in decarbonisation, circular economy, ecology, ecological recovery that we know needs to happen. But yet, a lot of these scientific disciplines don't have an element of design or placemaking or community engagement or co-creation as part of their training and their sort of professional background. So I really see the need for these two camps to really come together to have a much more interdisciplinary approach to sustainability and to the creation of places and to urban design. So in today's episode, I'm going to lay out what I mean by sustainable placemaking and a framework and a process for how you could start applying this principle in your own projects. Urban design and placemaking principles are extremely well documented and understood. We've been talking about this stuff for decades, yet placemaking, high quality urban design often doesn't happen in practice in development projects. In the same way, sustainability knowledge is now growing and is becoming more widespread, and there's excellent specialists and professionals out there specializing in sustainability, in urban design and planning and architecture, and yet development projects often miss obvious opportunities for sustainability. And so this tells me it's not about a lack of knowledge, it's not about a lack of technology, it's about the process. It's about the design and development process of new projects coming up, being delivered, and not being optimized to create places and sustainable places. The other point to make here before I get into the main discussion today is that sustainability is not just about carbon emissions and the technology that we use, like solar panels or electric vehicle charging. That's all really essential. It's also about human behavior. It's about how people live, their lifestyles, how they move around, what kind of choices are available to them, how they shop, how they interact with nature. And then there's feedback loops in terms of the kind of places that people live in and how that then gets reflected in their values, whether they have pro-sustainability behaviors, whether they have a connection and a love of nature, which is then reflected in their voting behavior or their purchasing decisions. So clearly, the kind of urban form and the kind of places people live in have a really important implication for sustainability at a broad level. And the other part of this that I'll touch on is this idea of creating places that will stand the test of time. There are lots of buildings and neighbourhoods that get demolished after only a couple of decades of existence. And yet there's other parts of our cities that have stood for hundreds of years and have been adapted over time without being, demolished and rebuilt. So that's a really important part of sustainability as well. Not just getting the technical aspects right, designing a place that will be well loved, that is beautiful, that speaks to a particular culture, that is fit for its environment and its place, and that can last 100 plus years into the future. That should be a goal of all the development that we are doing. So just a quick little update, a little call to action before we get into the main part of the episode. I have just created a new website, which is greenurbanist.org. This is a little bit separate from my podcasting website, which is greenurbanistpod.com. That still exists, but I've finally managed to bring all the work that I do under one roof on the internet, a virtual roof, which is greenurbanist.org. And here you can go to learn about some of my experience and some of the projects I've been involved in as an urban designer. But importantly, you can also go and set up a discovery call with me if you want to discuss any of your projects and see about opportunities where I maybe could give some advice, provide some consulting and some coaching at the early stages of a project on this sustainable placemaking framework that I'm going to be discussing today. So bear that in mind. The link is in the episode description, of course, but let's get into the episode for now. So, what is sustainable placemaking? I don't think I'm the first person to use this term. Certainly I haven't coined it. If you search sustainable placemaking online, you'll find reference to it in lots of places. I don't think it has a very, widely agreed definition, but I think it encapsulates this framework that I've been developing and that I use when I'm working with clients around a holistic approach to creating places that support human flourishing and ecological health. So I think urban design as a discipline, and that's my background as an urban designer and planner, has been very much focused on the human being for the last couple of decades. And that's a response to sort of post-war planning, which was very inhumane in many ways, very inhuman. And so really putting creating human scale cities and places, thinking about human experience and human psychology when we're designing places. And that's all fantastic. But I think in that sort of body of work that's emerged over the last couple of decades, really since the 1980s, we have forgotten, or perhaps we never knew, to also be designing for nature, for ecology, for wildlife, and for natural processes. So that's why human flourishing and ecological health are both the sort of key goals of this holistic approach of sustainable placemaking. It's also a framework for decision making in the early stages of a development project, so you can bake in sustainability and placemaking principles. And this comes back to the point I made earlier around the design and planning process, often not prioritizing or optimizing for sustainability and placemaking outcomes, which is why we often get places that are very soulless, that are poorly designed, that don't work for people, but also don't work for nature, are highly polluting, and reinforce unsustainable behaviors. So I think if we can work, go upstream and work on the design and development process of how we actually design these places, we have a much better chance of baking in important sustainability and placemaking principles. So the place we get at the end, maybe several years later when it's finally constructed, actually lives up to our ambitions and the kind of ambitions we need to have in response to climate change, biodiversity loss, etc. The other thing to say about a sustainable placemaking approach is that it's vision and opportunity led rather than constraints led. So I see so many master plans, development projects that are constraints led. So you start by analyzing all the places you can't build, all the things you can't do, all the things that kind of restrict your creativity, and then you sort of squeeze in whatever you want to deliver in between that. And often what results from that constraints-led approach is a very fragmented place where you're squeezing in the number of houses or the numbers of square meters that you need to sort of make your development viable, but you're not creating a place. It's not connecting in with movement networks. It's not creating meaningful public spaces or opportunities for communities to come together. And so that's why we need to start with a vision led approach. I'll explain a bit more about what that means. An opportunity-led approach using the natural assets that are on site or the existing buildings or structures on site as opportunities for placemaking. And then later on, constraints will always come up. There's always constraints on development, but because we have a strong vision, we can integrate those in a way that we still have a cohesive and a coherent place at the end of it. Now, I do believe this process works at all scales. I tend to work at a master plan scale, so anything beyond, one or two buildings. If you're looking at an architectural design, like a single building or a public space design or a landscape, I think this process still applies. You'll just need to obviously adapt it to your situation, which you would have to do anyway, because design is always place and project specific. Okay, let's talk about the sustainable placemaking process. So this is an 8-part process that I've developed, and this is what I use when I'm working with clients. So if I was looking at a new development or an urban renewal project or something like that, I would go through a series of questions and prompts and exercises that would help us create a sustainable placemaking strategy. So we go through this process, and it's early stages before you've really, started your design work, because it's important to get this stuff baked in early on. So step 1 is, before you even think about designing your site or what goes on the site, map out and list out what are the communities and the existing stakeholders in or around your development that need to be involved in the design process. Create a stakeholder map. And then we really want to be thinking about going beyond traditional consultation. So probably the planning system will require you to do a basic level of consultation, tell people, surrounding people, that the development is happening and give them a chance to comment. That's like, one step away from doing nothing. That's just, that's compliance. But we want to go for best practice. And so what you want to be looking at is early opportunities for co-design and co-creation with the local community or business stakeholders, or whoever really has, will be interacting and has a stake in what you're doing in that project. The reason we do this is because, we as designers and planners, we can do great analysis, we can do GIS analysis, we can go out and walk the streets, get an understanding of what's going on. But unless you live in a place, you never know the whole story. And I've had so many situations in my career where we go in and we do a good public consultation, public engagement event, maybe a workshop with people around a round table, or we just go out and talk to people on the street. And it always flags up things that we never would have known otherwise. Tensions within the local area, how people feel when they walk down certain streets, the differences between particular neighborhoods that are side by side, reasons why people visit the town center or they don't visit the town center. All these things which are, kind of sometimes emotional, sometimes quite subjective. We can get there a little bit on our own, but, the fastest route to really understanding the stuff deeply is talking with the community, bringing them into the design process early on so they can have meaningful input. Now, this becomes a challenge when you are working on greenfield sites. You're in a place where there's really no local community yet. There will always be people who are involved, who are interested in being involved in development that's happening. And so that might mean going to the nearest town, the nearest village, the local landowners, the people who play football, 2 fields over, whatever. There will be people around to engage with, who will be able to give you insight into that place. Now, this sort of co-design, co-creation process doesn't just happen at the beginning. It doesn't just happen at the end before you make a planning submission. It should have touch points throughout your design process. So you start early on. Just a quick break to tell you about a free training and PDF download that you can access right now. It's called Urban Sustainability in 5 Case Studies. In it, I explain important sustainability principles through case studies of best practice, buildings, master plans, and public spaces. The link to the free training is in the episode description. You go back when you've got sort of a concept design, you go back when you have more detail, and you keep that relationship going over the months or years, depending on the scale of your development. And it pays massive dividends. It's an investment in time and resources, but gosh, it can save you so much heartache and so much trouble by getting this part right. So that's step 1. Step 2 is, again, don't even look inside the boundary of your site. Step 2 is called look beyond the red line. Typically, site boundaries in development projects are marked with a red line on a map. You want to start by looking beyond that and start with a wider analysis of the wider area. So that could be the local neighbourhoods around, it could be the wider landscape if you're in a rural area, the wider city, and you want to develop a good understanding of the urban character. So what are these surrounding neighbourhoods like? What are the buildings like? What are the streets like? What sort of character and identity do they have? You want to really understand the movement routes for both vehicles, people, public transport, bicycles, also people who have mobility aids like wheelchairs or walking sticks. Develop that understanding of how people move around in the local area and what that means for your site. Understand natural features, public spaces, water courses in the surrounding area, elevational changes, hills, local landmarks, all of that stuff needs to be understood before you start thinking about what goes on your site. That, of course, also includes things like land uses, local services, schools, hospitals, all that kind of stuff. Sure, a lot of you are, already doing that. But again, it's often I see developments, they get to a certain level of design and you ask a question like, what are the needs for, local services in the area? And design teams just don't know because they've skipped past this bit. So develop a good understanding beyond the red line. Your community engagement process, your co-design process will help with that as well, because people will basically tell you what is or is not in the local area and what their needs are. Step 3 is we're going to start now looking at our site in more detail, but we're going to start with an ecological baseline survey of the site. So this is where you bring in your ecologist or your landscape architect. It's a good point to mention that this process it's not meant that you, as say an urban designer or a planner, do all of this by yourself. You're working in a wider team, you have other consultants around or other in-house specialists, bring those in at the various points. It's a collaborative interdisciplinary process. So you're getting your ecological baseline analysis of the site. Really the questions you want answered are, what are the important habitats on site? Are there any important species? Are there important trees that should be retained? As well as the things like elevation, slope, landform, water courses, the way water is moving across the site. All of that stuff needs to be understood so that you can understand what needs to be kept, what can be enhanced as you look at the design for this site, what areas are low in ecological quality where it could be improved, and that gives you a baseline structure for the site layout. So you're basically not going to develop over the most ecologically rich parts of your site, but you're going to integrate those into your public space and your movement network, and you're going to set any sort of harmful development away from that. Really, really important. And in fact, in the UK, now with biodiversity net gain having come into law, a pre-development ecology survey is a requirement by law now anyway. So should be starting with this. Anyone working internationally can think of this as well as a best practice approach. I believe biodiversity net gain is just in England. Sorry, I said UK. I think it's just in England for the moment, not Wales and Scotland. Okay. The next part, step 4, we're actually going to zoom in a bit of detail before we zoom back out again and look at our master plan. That's because step 4 is looking at circular economy. So as we're analysing our existing site, and this will be pretty obvious, I mean, you'll know straight away what existing buildings, structures, and materials are on site. So do a material audit, work with a quantity surveyor or an engineer who specialises in this, see what can be kept and reused or what can be recycled. And it's not just about buildings. We can also look at paving materials and old defunct infrastructure, or anything sort of physical infrastructure materials that are on site. These can be useful resources. So I'll give you an example. Obviously, if there's an existing building on site, what we want to be thinking is, can we retain this and refurbish it in some way? That is a massive saving in carbon emissions and waste. There's also a big reputational risk around this because we've seen in recent years high profile buildings that are going to be demolished and rebuilt have gotten some bad press and have generated a lot of debate within our industry, certainly within the UK. And so I think there's a real sort of mindset shift happening now where we're saying that actually if there is existing buildings on site, and if they can be reused, refurbished, updated, adapted in any way, we have to be doing that because it makes such a big difference to the embodied carbon and the waste associated with the development. It's also, from a placemaking aspect, really important as a link to history, a link to local culture. Even if it's not architecturally a very special building or structure, retaining those older materials on site gives people a direct connection to place. It's a placemaking asset. The other thing is have a think about if you are in a historic city in any way. If let's say you're looking at a brownfield site, often underneath asphalt, if you peel back that upper layer of asphalt, there will often be historic paving slabs underneath streets and public spaces, so cobblestones or granite sets. These are, what a fantastic benefit in terms of placemaking. You've got a direct connection to the past there. You're also saving on, buying in new materials. You're also saving because you don't have to, you're saving on waste, etc. You don't have to harvest any new material to make that. So, and maybe they need to be moved around to different parts of the site depending on your design. But it starts with doing that material audit and figuring out what is on site. And then you can start thinking about creative reuse of those materials. And that will influence your detailed design later on. So there's kind of two outcomes from this stage. Either you find existing buildings or structures on site, and they form important elements within your plan because you're going to retain them, you're going to figure out how to refurbish them and make use of them. They can often become like key destinations or hubs within your plan. Step two, if there is no existing buildings, or if there's it's simply not feasible or possible to really refurbish them in place, look at deconstructing them and storing the existing materials on site or off site, and finding creative ways later on to reuse them in the design process. Again, carbon savings, waste savings, also a big placemaking asset. So at this point, you've done your wider analysis of the local area. You've spoken to the local community, gotten their input. You have an ecological baseline of the site, and you have a kind of material baseline or circular economy audit of your site. At this point, you basically have enough to start looking at creating three things, which is a vision, a narrative, and a strategy for your project. Now, a vision, narrative, and strategy, these are three words that are often used interchangeably, and people use them in different ways. I'm going to set out exactly what I mean by these and why I'm using those three terms specifically. Number one, a vision. The vision is, what kind of place will this be in the future? Think 10 years in the future, 20 years into the future. What kind of place are you making here? How does it integrate with the local area? How does it benefit the wider area? What kind of lives will people live here? What kind of wildlife and nature will be thriving on this site? These are the kind of questions you explore in the vision. It can be a short statement. It can be an illustration or a series of graphics associated with that. And it's really answering that question of what are we creating here and what's it going to be like in the near future? Then the narrative element of it is, why are we doing this? It's a storytelling aspect. It's about communication. And really it's about going beyond compliance. I remember working on a few years ago with a developer and a design team who were doing some really interesting stuff in a small town in England, and they were developing a site for housing, but they were putting in all this sustainable drainage infrastructure because the whole town was very at risk. It was very vulnerable to flooding. So they were putting this in to actually reduce the flood risk for the surrounding town. They were also, trying to bring the heart back into the town by putting in some local services in a town centre site. They were really doing a lot of really good things, but they hadn't got a coherent narrative around it at all. They were all sort of separate things in separate boxes. And so I sort of said to them, like, you've got such a great sustainability narrative here that will be really convincing for local people and for the local authority when you make a planning application. Like, you need to pull that together and really just celebrate what you're doing and not think of it as just a series of compliance checkboxes. That is what you are doing to unlock development. And then finally, we have the strategy. So we have our vision, which is our sort of big, what will this place be in the future? We have our narrative, which is about why are we doing this? Why are we creating this place? And showing people how all the things we're doing are sort of coming together in a coherent whole. And then the strategy is the more technical aspect. It's the nuts and bolts of achieving the vision. This is where you set targets around decarbonisation, net zero carbon, waste reduction, water use, also things like biodiversity and biodiversity net gain, flood resilience, canopy cover, these climate adaptation aspects. You can also think about things like local economy, benefits to the local community and local economy. So this is where you get into more of the tangible targets, setting out exactly what you're aiming to achieve with this. And the strategy tied to the vision explained in the narrative. That is a piece that is so often missing in new development, large and small. And we need to get it right because that will steer the rest of the detailed design that we get into. If we have all that stuff nailed down and we have our team of professionals all signed up to this vision and this strategy, then everything becomes easier from there, and we're much more likely to actually deliver a really high quality and a really sustainable place. Moving on now to step 6. This is the master planning and the concept design phase. Again, maybe if you're not doing a sort of larger development, maybe you're just looking at a smaller individual building or a public space, there's still an element of master planning there because everything has a local context that you're connecting into, and you're starting with that concept design. You're explaining what is it that we're actually creating here based on our vision and our strategy. I jokingly say at this point, the site designs itself or the project designs itself. And that's because if you've done the proper analysis, you've talked to the local community, you know what existing structures are on site, you have an ecological baseline, you know the movement routes, you know the local land uses. If you know all that, the layout of the site becomes pretty obvious. The movement routes become obvious because you're connecting in with the surrounding street network and you're creating a simple, permeable street network within your site. Looking at things like public transport, cycling, walking, etc. can become, more detailed. And thinking about how these things co-locate with your land uses. Your land uses or your building uses on site, again, should be fairly clear based on the analysis that you did, the kind of community input, your knowledge now of knowing what the local area needs. And presumably at this point, you've done some sort of economic analysis, so you know what's actually feasible to produce on site. That comes in here. That ties in with the movement routes. You have your ecological areas and your natural features. They form the basis of your public space, your green corridors, and your nature enhancement areas. You can start to see which areas are rich in ecology that you need to give a bit of breathing space to. You start to see the places that are less ecologically rich where you can start to enhance. So this is this sort of opportunity-led approach again here. And then finally, you have what your retained structures, retained buildings or materials are on site, and they become key structuring elements within the master plan, creating key destinations or simply giving a hint to how surrounding streets will interact, with that existing building. It might be just a single old pub building that has survived over the years when the rest of it, went into, was sort of demolished or was destroyed in some way. And so that becomes a structuring element that you can use to influence the rest of your design. So it really all starts to come together in this stage. I haven't talked about so much buildings, architecture, building density. Let's move on to step 7. So you've done your master plan, your concept design, step 6. Step 7, looking in a bit more detail at the buildings. And this is where it gets more debatable, more subjective, and there are trade-offs in the type of urban form, the type of building form that you make use of. So you've obviously done your character analysis of the local area at this point. You know what is the surrounding density, urban form, building form that's typical around. And you have a decision to make about whether you replicate or you mirror or you take inspiration from what is around to try and keep your development very coherent and cohesive with the surrounding area. Or do you make a decision to do something different because that's what is needed here on this site? That's what is needed for the local area. And there's trade-offs involved. So often development will be coming forward on the edge of settlements or in lower density suburban areas where it's a very low density environment. And we often talk about, if we're building there, we need to be also delivering a sort of low density, and we need densities to sort of peter off towards the edge of a settlement. That's a very British urbanism type approach. Now I'm live in Italy right now, and I've traveled across Europe. They don't do that in other parts of the world. That you often have a very kind of abrupt edge of like a medium and high density edge of a city, and then fields. And that's another approach, and that's culturally just different in other places. So I think what I would say is we need to make a holistic decision here. We shouldn't just be necessarily mirroring exactly what's around us or feeling trapped in sort of doing things because it's historically what we've done. So let's just think about, in sustainability and placemaking terms, what are some of the trade-offs here? With lower density development, semi-detached and detached houses, everyone has a garden, everyone has parking spaces, off street, typical kind of stuff we see coming forward across Britain. When you sort of sprawl out like that, there actually is some benefits in terms of you'll often have more green cover overall across a site, which can be good for microclimate, can be good for ecology. But you're taking up so much land with sort of private spaces and with streets and parking, private gardens, etc. You often have less public space to play with overall. And because of that low density, you just don't have the critical mass for local services, for public transport. You end up creating more car-dependent places, and that's exactly what we're seeing with a lot of this low-density sprawl that's happening. However, in terms of, if we zoom back into sort of the decarbonisation element, there is more opportunity in these lower density places for rooftop solar panels, for battery energy storage, and for electric vehicle charging, as well as things like, I think probably local scale renewable technology like that. So let's think about sort of the other end of the spectrum, high density. Higher density, tall buildings, skyscrapers, very high density living. It obviously makes better use of land. It's a more efficient use of land. You need less land overall to house the same number of people or the same amount of uses. And that means you have the critical mass to support public transport, walking, cycling, local services. But there is less opportunity for that renewable energy technology, green roofs, solar panels on roofs, etc. You just have less space to play with, and you have so much intensity of energy use that a couple of solar panels on the roof of your skyscraper does very little to offset the energy that you're using. There can also be microclimate issues in higher density areas. If you've got a cluster of skyscrapers, often you will end up with very dark, windy, desolate streets, and that just kills street life. That's a sort of placemaking minus point there. On the other hand, having an element of density can help to keep streets cool during the summer. So this is very sort of location and environment dependent. It might be benefits for the summer and disbenefits for the winter, trade-offs. That's the theme of this this discussion. I will say research points to the fact that very high or very low densities in terms of housing densities is not optimal for community cohesion and social interaction. So very low density suburbs, you might get to know your neighbours on each side, you sort of chat to them over the fence, but there's no sort of central node, and there's not enough density for you to really get to know your neighbours and form a coherent community there. There's obviously going to be examples where this does happen, but this is sort of what the research points towards. Equally, very high density skyscraper living, it doesn't create a safe zone, like a third place for people to have casual social interactions. There's a lot of very awkward social interactions in elevators and lifts and corridors and that kind of thing. People tend to come in and out of their building and they don't know their neighbours, even if they're living right next door. So because of these various things, we often talk about medium density or a gentle density as a kind of a sweet spot between all these trade-offs. So this would be the sort of quite European 3 to 6 story terraced or courtyard block type arrangements, which tend to work very well in terms of being an efficient use of land, creating walkable, bikeable neighbourhoods, support for local services, but also opportunities within the design for community, for social interaction, for community creation as well. It's very particular to the context. You really need to make your own decision on this. But we'll say in a British and European context, this sort of medium density is really, really quite considered best practice at the moment. Finally, we're on to the final stage in this sustainable placemaking process, stage 8. And this is the detailed placemaking aspects that affect human experience. So we've really been looking down on our master plan, on our development from, the aerial view and thinking about it spatially like that. Now we're going to zoom in to the human view and think about the human experience. And this is where we really get into how we can do placemaking, essentially create a really great place to live, but also foster sustainable lifestyles, give people those opportunities to live in a healthier and more sustainable way. So this means looking at the detailed public realm and street design, public art, the kind of materials that we're using, the interface between buildings and streets, the co-location of services, street trees, how we design bike storage and bike parking so that gets precedent and it becomes a first choice for people ahead of using vehicles, and where are we storing vehicles, if at all, within our development, and the locations of public transport, where we're co-locating that so it's easier for people to get to and use, and the design of all that. All of this is the detailed stuff that really, really makes a difference. These really affect people's travel behaviour and therefore the emissions associated with transport. A exercise that you can do if you have a sort of outline master plan, sort of concept master plan, is to map out a couple of hypothetical journeys of future users. So just pick a random house and say, how would this person walk their child to school and then swing by the local shop before going back home? Or go to the bus stop to go to work and then come back in the evening. And you really walk your way through the master plan and you figure out, this junction is terrible. It's a really convoluted route to get here. This doesn't make any sense. And you do a couple of those and that gives you that sort of human scale, eye level understanding of whether your place is really working in a coherent way. The other thing at this point is we can really start thinking about the human nature connection and the quality, the sort of biophilic elements and the quality of interacting with nature that we can get in our development. It is one thing to have a big section of our plan, outlined as like a nature reserve or a place for ecology. But if it is, fenced off, restricted access, if there's nothing for people to do there, if it is not a place that also integrates humans being there in a respectful and safe way, then, we're missing out a huge opportunity there. And that could actually be, that's a minus in terms of the placemaking aspects. So we need to be really thinking about not just the visual connections to nature, but the activities in nature, the way that we can have nature integrated in our daily life from sort of, doorstep, front porch to street to local, park and public space. Can we, seeing trees outside of our window, but then also being immersed in habitats and natural environments a couple of times a week as well. Multifunctional spaces that are for ecology, that help us with climate adaptation, with flood resilience, with cooling, but also offer within that opportunities for recreation. Maybe that's just walking, maybe that's designated areas to play football so people aren't, disturbing important habitats. We really start to think through all of these interactions. The reason this is important from a sustainability point of view, first of all, connection with nature is so important for our health. It reduces blood pressure, reduces stress. It's good for our mental and physical health. People who spend more time in nature have lower incidences of heart disease and diabetes, all these kind of things. But the research also shows that people who have a high level of nature connection and a high sense of biophilia, love for nature, and get to experience nature frequently, tend to have more pro-environmental behaviors and lifestyles, voting decisions, purchasing decisions, etc. So we get this sort of positive feedback loop here. So I could talk at length of the sort of detailed placemaking aspects. We can also talk about architectural style, materials, connection to history and to local culture. There's also, in the early stages of our project, thinking about meanwhile uses and events and sort of community initiatives, so we can start to build community early on in the process. There's also aspects of how people will have stewardship over their area. Can they have a plot for growing food? Can they, tend to the landscape in some way on a voluntary basis? These are all, ways that people form a connection to place, form community bonds, all part of a placemaking approach that ultimately means a place will be well loved, will be taken care of, and will stand the test of time. That is the end of my sort of 8-part sustainable placemaking process for today. There's a lot more detail involved in this. We can talk about detailed strategies for circular economy, for street design and sustainable mobility. And in fact, I will talk about those things in future episodes. But for today, I just wanted to sort of walk you through that high-level process, how I think about creating places that are sustainable and starting from that really high level so that the sort of placemaking professions like architects and urban designers and planners can work in a synergistic way with the more technical disciplines, people who are looking at decarbonisation and circular economy and ecology, and how we can really start to work in a very multidisciplinary way to make sure we're creating places, doing placemaking, but in a way that maximizes the opportunities for sustainability, for decarbonisation, and for having positive impacts on the environment. If you're interested in working together or seeing how I might be able to support a project that you're working on, you can set up a discovery call via my website, greenurbanist.org. Link is in the episode description. Great speaking with you today. I'll see you again very soon for another episode.